Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our seminar today. We have Jack Greenhalgh, who is here to present to us about his work on freshwater soundscape monitoring. He's a student at Bristol University. He's working on freshwater acoustics, and you'll give a bit more of a background to where he's come from as well. You might have overheard our brief chat just before we started the seminar. He also has his Viva next Friday, so feel free to come up with some good questions if you want to help prep him for everything that's going on. But otherwise, I will let you take it away, Jack. Off you go.
Thank you very much. So my name's Jack, and I've been studying over the last 4 years for my PhD the bizarre and mysterious underwater acoustic world of ponds and rivers as a way of trying to monitor ecosystem health and condition, and also trying to understand some functional processes that are going on in ponds as well. And so I'm going to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes or so just introducing you to this mysterious world and explaining a little bit about some of my research. So first of all, I think it's important just to underline how under threat freshwater ecosystems are. I mean, we're at a biodiversity crisis, and especially in fresh waters. We're losing wetlands 3 times faster than we're losing rainforests globally. And we've lost 84% of freshwater biodiversity since 1970. So no other ecosystem on Earth is feeling this crisis more than freshwaters. We've lost 97% of freshwater megafauna as well since the 70s. And also, freshwaters are really important for climate change and mitigating the effects of climate change. Peatlands account for just 3% of the world's land surface area, but they store twice as much carbon as forests. So really important for tackling biodiversity crises, but also the climate crisis. Now, conventional methods that we use to survey freshwater ecosystems, it's very important to survey and to monitor ecosystems, of course, to understand what's going on. What are the effects of climate change or the effects of pollution or different land management styles. And so surveying really is at the heart of understanding what's going on. And conventional methods that we use to survey freshwater ecosystems, such as using a pond net here to sweep around, thrash around in the plants to look for insects, is often quite invasive because you can disturb and often destroy the habitat a little bit while you do this. You're also only capturing one point in time because you're there and you take the sample and that's that. If you wanted to get more time points, then that could be incredibly labor intensive. You also need specialist expertise to identify these macroinvertebrates. So it can be quite a challenge. And there's a bottleneck there in terms of the number of qualified people with the experience and the skill set that are able to carry out this monitoring. Where with ecoacoustics, which is the science of recording all the sounds in the environment, i.e. the soundscape, to address ecological questions, is really simply listening. And so I've got a picture here of an underwater microphone or a hydrophone, and I've got one here. This is what one looks like. And these are relatively inexpensive things. I mean, you can buy them for as cheap as £50. This one is about £150, so still pretty cheap. And you can set these things up to record for long periods of time. So they can be non-invasive as you're simply just listening. You can capture long time periods, and you don't necessarily need to kill target organisms that you're trying to detect or spend any time really in the lab trying to identify them. So the soundscape that I mentioned can be divided up into 3 main parts. So the geophony, which is characterized by sounds produced by the weather, earthquakes and landslides, etc. The anthrophony, sounds produced by humans, vehicles, and in the marine environment, seismic surveys where people send sonic booms down to look for oil deposits is a big threat to marine biodiversity. And then what I'm really interested in and I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk is the biophony, sounds produced by life. Now, sound and the production of sound is really significant in biology. Many animals produce sound and use it for various aspects of their life history. So for attracting mates and asserting status, locating prey and conspecifics, for avoiding predators and navigating. And here actually is a little video of a pretty charismatic sound producer of the animal kingdom, the red howler. So I'll just play this video. And while I'm playing the video, consider this image down here on the right. This is a visual representation of sound in what's called a spectrogram, which visualizes the frequency or kind of the tone of the sound as a frequency of time. So here we go, charismatic sound producer of the animal kingdom. Okay, there we are. Now lots of animals are producing sound, so there's a lot of competition for acoustic space, so sounds at different frequencies. So there's this idea of acoustic niche partitioning, whereby different species produce sounds at different frequencies so that they can avoid competing for each other by calling over the top of one another. And so one of the famous examples of this is with frogs in the rainforest. You can see here that different sites where they've been recording, these little bar charts are representing different species of frog that are calling at different frequency ranges there. And this is something that I'll touch on a bit later on. Now we know quite a bit about marine soundscapes. There's some fascinating research that's come out quite recently to do with understanding that the sound of a healthy coral reef is really important for attracting pelagic larvae of reef fishes to that reef. So these are little larvae of things floating around just off the reef surface, and they're actually drawn into the sounds of a healthy reef because they know it's going to be a good place to come and spend the rest of their lives. And this amazing paper recorded the sound of a healthy coral reef and then played the sounds back in a degraded coral reef habitat, and then they were able to draw these larvae in. So a really important tool there for restoration, perhaps. And then also we know quite famously about whale song, and that some of the really popular whale songs, like the ABBA of the whale world, those songs are shared horizontally through the communities of humpback whales around the world, and you get kind of pop songs. So lots of stories from the marine environment. And the songs of humpback whales have been really important, actually. Capturing the songs of humpback whales has been really important for whale conservation. And I think for the first time, this album, Songs of the Humpback Whale, made by Roger Payne in the 1970s, was quite a significant step for providing a kind of a deeper emotional connection to something that is quite abstract, far away, deep in the ocean we can't see, but people were able to anthropomorphize with those songs and cared a lot. And as a result, we have quite a lot of whale species in the world now with increasing populations. So perhaps recording the sounds in ponds might replicate a little bit of that. Even a little bit of that would be amazing, just to kind of as a way of highlighting the biodiversity in fresh waters. But about fresh waters, I mean, really, we don't know a lot about their soundscapes. The first description of underwater acoustic diversity was actually published as recently as 2015. So this is a new and emerging field with lots to discover. And really there are three main challenges facing the field of freshwater ecoacoustics, the way that I see it. The first one is that there's a lack of species-specific sounds that we know of. So for things like bats and a lot of birds as well, I would imagine, there's quite a well-established library of sounds that we know. That's a robin and that's a red. But for fresh waters, we really only know a handful. This is as simple as that. And we also have quite a limited understanding of the ecology and the phonology of soundscapes in fresh waters. So we don't necessarily fully understand yet how does species richness of macroinvertebrates relate to measures of the soundscape diversity. And we don't really understand how freshwater soundscapes change through the course of a day or through the course of a year. And so these are things I'm going to touch on as well in a minute. And then also there's this lack of adequate machine learning techniques for freshwaters at the moment. And so recently there's been some really good and exciting developments in detecting and classifying whale song using machine learning techniques. And I think there's a big opportunity to apply those techniques to freshwaters to do the same. And so we do know that a lot of things are capable of producing sound in freshwaters, even if we don't have detailed descriptions of those sounds yet. So this is a PhD before me, Camille, was a student in France. She estimated there's about 170 snifferous species of freshwater, or freshwater species in France. Mostly amphibians, but also, well, a lot of insects, mostly insects, and a few amphibians there, some fishes and some crustaceans. So it's quite a diversity of things that produce sound, which could be really useful information for ecological monitoring. At the beginning of my PhD, I conducted a systematic review with Camille, and we were interested in focusing on of the studies that have been published before, what taxonomic group have they focused on? Because we had this suspicion that aquatic insects are really right at the heart of a lot of freshwater soundscapes, certainly in temperate zones. They seem to be really dominant from our observational experience, but our impression was that there seems to be a bias towards fish, and that's indeed what we found. Nearly half of the studies that have been conducted, so we looked at 124 research articles, were conducted on fish, and this is probably because it's quite easy to keep fish in laboratories. People have been doing it for a long time. They use fish in laboratories for other things, and so perhaps it's easy to build in a bioacoustic element on top of that. But really what we suggested in this review is that there should be a focus on arthropod sounds, because they're kind of, like I said, they're contributing most significantly to the soundscape. And then we also noticed that from the 70s up to kind of the last couple of decades, there's been this shift from recording just one species sound, which is really bioacoustics, describing species sounds, towards monitoring the whole soundscape, i.e. ecoacoustics. Now I mentioned the beetles and the bugs being main contributors to the soundscape. Well, they produce sound quite amazingly by this process of stridulation, which is where they rub two hard body parts together to produce sound, kind of like crickets do in a field. And these are some microscope images that I've taken of some water beetle and a water boatman here. Water boatmen in particular, water bugs, are really abundant sound producers in a lot of ponds and rivers, kind of all around the world, really, it seems. So they're, I think, for me, key to understanding freshwater soundscapes a little bit more. And here you can just see on the right-hand side some of the stridulatory organs, as they're called. They have names like files and scrapers, plectrums, kind of musical instrument names associated with them. Actually, we've known for a long time that different species of water boatmen and beetles must produce sounds different to one another, because a lot of IID guides focus on drawing distinctions between their sound producing anatomy in order to differentiate them. So it's logical, therefore, to assume that they must be producing different sounds if they're holding different musical instruments. And so we can measure the sounds of these insects. Here's a spectrogram like from before, but this is of a water boatman, and I'm going to play the water boatman sound for you now. Okay, hopefully you can hear that okay. So that's kind of almost ubiquitous in pond soundscapes, that noise, kind of that eerie rasping sound. And there's a particular species of water boatman called Micronecta, in a Micronecta genus, is capable of producing a sound with more acoustic energy than, it says here, 227 marine or terrestrial mammal species relative to its body size. So an incredibly loud noise is produced by this animal here. So that's really quite amazing, I think. And they produce this sound, mostly water boatman sounds are produced by males, and they're used to assert dominance or to attract mates. So that's what they're doing there. And it's kind of a runaway selected trait. That's why it's been allowed to get so loud. But it's not just insects that are producing sounds, or even just animals, it's plants too, rather amazingly. And I've got a little video here, hopefully shows this. So here is a submerged aquatic plant. And if you look carefully, hopefully you can see some oxygen bubbles. Excuse me, oxygen bubbles coming out of the leaf there. Let's play it again. Just kind of up here. Tiny oxygen bubbles coming out, and this is what's producing the sound as the plant's respiring in the hot sun. And when I've had my hydrophone next to a plant like this on a hot summer's day, it's kind of like standing next to a big factory whirring away. And what we think is happening is that as the plant's photosynthesizing, oxygen concentrations are building up inside the leaf structure. And when they get to a point, when the concentration gets to a point where it's greater than that of the oxygen dissolved in the surrounding water, it then streams out along a concentration gradient, producing this sound. And I've got a little sound up here. So this is the rigid hornwort. And so those sounds are really characterized by this consistent ticking noise. And then so when we've got an understanding of some of the aquatic insects and the plants, we can start to build up a picture of the freshwater soundscape in its entirety. And so here we've got sounds produced by aquatic insects around kind of a 3 to 4 kilohertz range, and then plants a bit higher up. But also we have sounds produced by decomposition as well. So methane bubbles that are produced as bacteria and microorganisms are breaking down leaf litter, etc. Methane bubbles are released, and we can hear those popping on the surface. So there are ways then perhaps that we could use freshwater ecoacoustics to monitor biodiversity in terms of its aquatic insects and plants, but also primary productivity with relation to plant respiration, but also the decompositional rates, and maybe look into the effects that might be having to climate change as well. So lots of different angles to take freshwater ecoacoustic monitoring. And so now I'll just play a recording of the soundscape in its entirety. And so this was recorded in Aldsney Park Pond in Bristol in the UK. Okay, so almost sounds like a jungle, I think. There's an awful lot going on, which is pretty amazing. So how do we make sense of all of this diversity and all these different sounds happening at once in a soundscape? Well, the main method of analysis at the moment is using acoustic indices, which are mathematical functions that consider different aspects of the recording to derive a numerical value. So there's lots of different acoustic indices. I won't go into them in too much detail, but in the figure here in the bottom left, you can see that there are 4 different acoustic indices, and they're considering the soundscape here in different ways, as illustrated by these white lines. And so to take an example here, in the panel C, the bioacoustic index is considering all of the sounds produced between the frequency range within those white lines. Whereas in the panel A, the acoustic complexity index is considering one kilohertz frequency unit steps up through the soundscape, and is comparing the differences in amplitude between those. And so really they're kind of a rough and ready way of describing trends in soundscapes. It's difficult to relate them to biodiversity, and it can be difficult to draw kind of steadfast, meaningful conclusions from them, but you can use them quite effectively to describe broad scale changes in soundscapes. And so over the period of a day, so I've got this picture here showing that. So this is an acoustic index that's been plotted over a period of 24 hours, and you can see that there's some variation there. And the main benefit of it is that you can just plug these SD cards containing all of your data into the computer, and then you can calculate these indices in an automatic way and in a standardized way. And so that really they're quite useful for this early stage of trying to understand freshwater ecosystems and their soundscapes. Okay, so one of the things I also did during my PhD was to develop a rapid acoustic survey protocol for ponds. And we did this by focusing on using these acoustic indices. And so this is a rapid approach, so it's not a comprehensive approach by any means. It's really designed for ecological consultants to use while they're visiting a site, and they can carry along some equipment with them to record ponds and just quickly do this in addition perhaps to what they're doing there already. And so the way it would work is you go around 10 different microhabitats of the pond and recording for a minute, and then you have this representation then of the pond's microhabitats and the sounds within them. And then you can combine these recordings, calculate different acoustic indice values, and then try and relate that to metrics of habitat quality. And so what we've got here is the bioacoustic index, which is that index that considers really the biophony section of the soundscape. We're relating values of that to habitat suitability index, which is an index that consultants use, I believe, to judge the suitability of a habitat for great crested newts. So yeah, you would imagine that that's indicative of good quality freshwater habitat. And you can see that there's this really gentle, albeit significant, but gentle correlation with that. So it needs a lot more work there to kind of tease out those the relationship there for to the soundscape and the ecology is left wanting, but there's some promise there. And the main thing behind this method is that we have this online community where people are submitting recordings of freshwater soundscapes, which is a great resource then for now and for the future, to come back and to reanalyze those when methods have expanded and become more advanced. Now that method wouldn't consider the daily acoustic variation in ponds, and we know that there's daily acoustic variation in woodlands. I mean, we have a dawn chorus, but what about in freshwater ecosystems? Well, a study published quite recently in 2020 of a tropical swamp in Costa Rica and by Ben Gottesman showed exactly that there is quite a significant, a clear trend in diurnal soundscape patterns. And here we've got on the right hand side some visualizations of acoustic indices showing, and in B here, this panel B on the right hand side is this bioacoustic index again, which is really focusing on the biophony. And you can see that there's some pretty interesting trends there, quite active during the night time, relatively active during the daytime, and then these mysterious quiet peaks, or troughs I should say, quiet troughs around sunrise and sunset. So that's kind of intriguing, and you can see that a little bit more clearly on this image, a spectrogram image on the bottom left. So that's interesting. Okay, so what about for temperate ponds? What do they have? Diurnal soundscape variation? Well, I mean, we weren't quite so sure. So I spent some time during my PhD looking into that as well. And I wanted to relate this to macroinvertebrates. So what we did is we looked at 5 different ponds around Bristol, and this is what I did during the lockdown. I got on my bike and cycled all around Bristol with my recording equipment and a pond net strapped to my bike. And I looked at these different sites, and I deployed a hydrophone with a recorder for a week in each one. And so we captured 168 hours of continuous monitoring data for each pond. And we also looked at the macroinvertebrates. And so I'll explain the macroinvertebrates first. So over here on the left-hand side, Abbott's Pool, and Old Sneed Park, and Chew Magna Reservoir, these were some of the noisier ponds, for lack of a better word. And they contained all of these species that I would expect that a noisy pond would contain, things like water boatmen, water bugs, water beetles. And then Eastwood Farm and Scrobmore Reservoir, these were kind of more open water habitats, and these were less biologically complex, and they contained things like mayfly nymphs, for example. And so there's this indication here into a little bit about what's contributing to the soundscapes. And so what I also wanted to do was to evaluate the use of different acoustic indices to understand how to, which acoustic indice is going to be best for picking out diel variation, and also which acoustic indices are good for use in freshwaters for understanding biologically complex soundscapes. So ones that are dominated by multiple species of beetles and bugs, or ones that only contain one species or 0 species. And so in order to do that, I used quite a simple machine learning method approach called a random forest. And what you do is you kind of input all your data, and then you give it a factor. And so for diel period, I defined it either as day or night, which I categorized based on sunrise and sunset times for those days. And those are represented by these blue, purpley spots. I'm not quite sure what color that is. And what we found is that this index H, which is acoustic entropy, basically that considers the entire frequency bandwidth of the soundscape. So that's sampling everything, in essence. And that was really good for describing or for categorizing, therefore, whether it's a daytime recording or a nighttime recording. The way that works is you train some of the data. So I had a label out all of the data, and then I have 30% of that data where I tell the computer, this is what a daytime recording looks like, and this is what a nighttime recording looks like. And then I apply that to the remaining 70%, which is the computer then has to work out, and it does so by this process of all these decision trees, which is a process that I have kind of visualized down here. And then it will tell you, it will rank all of these different variables here, and based on how important they are in determining whether you've got a nighttime or a daytime. And so this here is visualized for acoustic entropy. You see the mean Gini variable, which is kind of a bit of an abstract thing, but basically the higher this value, the more important it is. And so we could see for acoustic entropy for H, this purple dot is quite far on the right, so that's quite important for determining whether it's a daytime or a nighttime recording, so that's quite useful. But things like the acoustic diversity index, ADI, is less useful. Then I also did that, like I said, for insect dominated or insect sparse. These are represented by the green dots. And so we've got the normalized different soundscape index is really useful for distinguishing between whether you've got a soundscape that's dominated by insects or has very few insects. And then the biodiversity index as well, there is the second most important, which is what we would expect. The normalized different soundscape index and the biodiversity index are actually quite similar. They're looking at very, very similar parts of the frequency spectra. It's just the normalized difference soundscape index is also looking at the lowest frequencies and taking that into consideration too. So simply put, there are some acoustic indices that are good for determining whether you have a daytime or a nighttime recording. And then there are some that are really good for determining insect dominated or insect sparse. And these results are confirmed by a generalized linear mixed model as well. And what we found across sites is that diel period was consistently significant, basically, for all acoustic indices that we looked at, apart from acoustic evenness. So it's showing there that there's a really clear effect between day and night, pretty much with using all of these different acoustic indices to characterize the soundscape. And we also found that the presence of water bugs or not is also very significant as well, in pretty much all these indices. But you can see here the effect sizes vary quite significantly. So we've got a very high effect size here for the insects Hemiptera for normalized difference soundscape index. Again, reiterating the importance of that index for characterizing whether you've got insect dominated or sparse pond soundscapes. And so these are the daily acoustic cycles of the ponds that we looked at. And so this is a decomposition of the time series, which is basically a generalized additive model. So a linear model that's been repeated lots of times, so that you can characterize with quite a high degree of accuracy the ups and downs of a daily cycle in a pond. And we found that all of these different sites had very clear daily acoustic activity cycles, but they were unique from one another. And there are two here we can take a closer look at, so Old Sneed Park and Chumagna Reservoir. And broadly speaking, the acoustic trends, the daily acoustic trends in ponds can be broken down into two parts. A nighttime part that's dominated by aquatic insects, and then a daytime part that's characterized by aquatic plants, which makes sense because they're photosynthesizing in the sunshine. And those soundscapes at different times of day look quite different as well. And so on the left-hand side here in the panel A, we have the insect-dominated 3 a.m. soundscape. And we can see there are two different genres of water boatmen here that are producing sounds at different frequency ranges. So they're exhibiting some kind of acoustic niche partitioning. And they're very active in the night. And they often call synchronously as a big chorus together as a way of kind of protecting themselves from predation of fishes as well. Kind of like shoaling fish, safety in numbers. And then aquatic plants dominating in the daytime and often around the solar zenith as well. And so the soundscape changes very considerably throughout the day. So I guess you've heard of a dawn chorus, but how about a midnight mass of insects? And you can kind of see this here. This is just one of the acoustic indices plotted over the course of a day, just as an indication of a generalized approach to the daily acoustic activity cycles in ponds. I mean, they're all individual and they all have their own idiosyncrasies, but generally speaking, they tended to have the aquatic insects in the night, like I said, and then this peak for aquatic plants during the daytime. And then another thing we did was we wanted to know how long should you record, how long should we record for in a pond until you've captured a significant portion of soundscape variation. And so we calculated the median values of different acoustic indices that we calculated based on an increasing sample time. And we calculated median values so that the effect would be independent of increasing sample size. And we blocked our blocks together. So we had, well, we put all the data together so from a site. So I had 168 hours of recordings from one site, and they were broken down into 15-second sound files that represented one row. And then so I had 240 rows that represented an hour. So I grouped those together, but then randomized them throughout the 168 hours and simulated, therefore, a deployment of a hydrophone in a pond that wasn't just describing this daily variation. So we removed that by randomizing the selection, and then calculated the median value so that it wouldn't just automatically decrease, the variance wouldn't automatically decrease with increasing sample size. And so what you're seeing when you're looking at these figures is just the variance that you're capturing with the soundscape is cumulatively decreasing over time as you're considering more and more of the soundscape, and that variation is falling away. And so when the lines start to level out, that's when you can think, okay, we've captured enough variation here, and that's probably the suggested minimum time that you should record for in order to capture a significant portion of soundscape variation. And what we found pretty consistently across all these different indices is that about 24 hours is enough, maybe just a little bit more than that. In some cases, it went on until about 72 hours. But really, you need to capture a full daily cycle, which makes sense, I think. And then there are also some problems, though, with this, because it's very easy to describe the broad scale changes, daily cycles and things like this. But the problem with passive acoustic monitoring is that it's quite difficult often to understand what these sounds are being produced by. And so the main way of doing that, of course, is to measure species-specific calls. And so we had some water boatman sounds earlier, and these are some water beetle sounds. So I'll play some water beetle sounds here that I recorded. So this is a cherrystone water beetle. I always thought that sounds a little bit like metal ball bearings in an egg shaker. And then this is a Supertramp. Yeah, so quite distinct sounds. And understanding the sounds produced by different beetles and macroinvertebrates is obviously really important for monitoring, because you can start to relate. So we've described the kind of the functional processes in ponds by using these acoustic indices to describe broad scale changes. But what about going the next step and thinking about how do we relate that to the ecology? And really, you need to have an understanding of these species-specific sounds, and then relating those to, in an ideal way, indicator species that are indicative of certain ecological conditions. And there are lots of ways to do this with macroinvertebrates. There are lots of different protocols, and they each give a particular weighting or a point scoring system to different taxa that are indicative of a good quality ecosystem. You get higher points and lower if it's a poor one. And so perhaps if we can relate species-specific sounds to key indicator species, then we could start to use freshwater soundscape monitoring as a way of monitoring ecosystem condition, which I think would be really quite useful and interesting. But it's not just a condition. Also, maybe you could look at the age of a pond or a freshwater habitat. Now, this is a paper published in 2008 that looked at predatory diving beetles and lots of other macroinvertebrates, and they showed that these diving beetles were indicative of younger ponds. They were early colonists. But then these things like weevils and leaf beetles were indicative of older ponds. So lots of interesting information that we could gain from harnessing an understanding of species-specific sounds and relating that to things like, or to understand things like ecological condition, but also ecosystem age. Now, kind of the main way of doing this, the only feasible way of doing this, is to automate it. For my master's project, I had some spectrograms, and I went through them all and manually annotated them and looked at them to try and characterize different sound types, because we didn't know at that point what these different sounds were related to. But trust me, that takes a very long time. If we could have some automated way of doing this with machine learning methods, then really that's the key to unlocking the full potential of freshwater ecosystem monitoring, soundscape monitoring. Now there's this study in 2015 that looked into this with a couple of water beetle species, and they were able to get some pretty high classification rates of these species, up to above 90% in some cases. But this data wasn't really scalable. You couldn't necessarily apply this model to a different data set effectively. So indicative of some early potential, but not necessarily all the way there. And so there's this huge prospect of using machine learning, and in particular applying recent advances in detecting and classifying marine mammal vocalizations. People have done this for sperm whale clicks and killer whale sounds. They've been able to use quite complicated image classification techniques in order to characterize these different spectrograms as a way of automatically detecting different species. And so here we've got this picture here of different species of water boatmen producing different sounds. And so we've got that. We know that they produce these different sounds, and we've got species-specific descriptions of these. So perhaps now we can use these as a way of training initial machine learning models. This is now where the future direction is going to go in the field, I think. And water boatman sounds are actually ideal for this, because what you need ideally is a regularly repeating pattern that can be easily trained and then easily detected, nothing too complicated or challenging. So, and obviously quite abundant, and that's all of the qualities that these water boatman stridulations have. So they could be used quite effectively, therefore, to train initial machine learning models. Now, a particular model approach that you could use is called a convolutional neural network, or a CNN. And put simply, what that does is it considers the pixels and the contours and the edges of these spectrogram images in layers of increasing complexity. And with enough training data, enough labeled training data, you could then apply this to data collected in the field to start automatically sorting and classifying key indicator freshwater macroinvertebrates that then you could use to make an inference of ecological health. Now, what you'd need then, of course, is a detailed understanding of what these water bugs and water beetles and things are telling you about the water quality that you're monitoring. And so there was a pretty comprehensive study in Finland in 2013 that did exactly this with water beetles, water boatmen, sorry, which is quite useful for me. So they looked at, well, they analysed over 90,000 water boatmen, which must have taken them absolutely years. And they looked at lots of different environmental variables and categorized them broadly into 5 different groups. And they were able to show that water boatmen, can be quite indicative of different types of water quality. So they have different categories here of species occurring in alkaline waters, or occurring in colder waters with some slightly brackish qualities, nutrient rich, species in running waters, species in acidic waters, and then just some kind of generalist species. So, okay, well, this is interesting. So we can take this knowledge, and we can take knowledge of using convolutional neural networks to classify marine mammal vocalizations, And we could take some basic knowledge that we have already of different water boatman sounds and tie all these things together. Perhaps in the future, we can have a way of monitoring freshwater soundscapes in a way that's automated by using this approach that's scalable, because you can apply these models once you've trained them effectively to long-term monitoring projects. And that can be really impactful because you could use it to identify key indicator species, signs of early ecosystem collapse. And so you could step in there with some management actions. You could use it to track invasive species and see which river reaches are particularly under threat, or are there any endangered populations of species that might be under threat, or locate some of the last few remaining populations of endangered species, and finding rare taxa like endangered species. You can put in lots of inexpensive recorders out in freshwater ecosystems to monitor the soundscapes for long periods of time. Therefore, you can increase your likelihood of detecting these rare taxa. And so I think there's great potential to combine all these different sciences together in order to create a very effective way of monitoring freshwater soundscapes. And then just to end, there's another thing that I touched on at the beginning with Roger Payne's album about whale sounds. And that's that, recording the sounds of ecosystems is great for science, but it's really, really powerful for public engagement as well. And there are lots of different industries that use audio recordings or are interested in audio recordings that you collect from the environment. And this is kind of just a bit of a silly nonsense graph that I've made. It doesn't really make much sense, but I hope does illustrate the interconnectivity rather of all these different different interests. So I mean, radio producers have contacted me before about using these underwater sounds and using them as soundtrack bits in films or covering for films. Sound artists have contacted me about using them for installations and making an album of pond sounds with a musician. And there's lots of ways in which using the data that we collect through freshwater soundscape monitoring can go beyond just academia, and can be really used as a powerful public engagement tool to highlight the biodiversity in freshwater ecosystems and to raise awareness of conservation actions. Okay, so to summarize then, so ecoacoustics can be used to reveal novel insights into freshwater ecosystem functions, so like these daily cycles and condition, potentially by using these key indicators of freshwater ecosystems. Temperate ponds possess clear daily acoustic activity cycles. And that finally, the future really is that acoustic monitoring paired with machine learning has huge untapped potential to monitor key freshwater species and infer ecological condition. So I'd just like to thank my various collaborators and supervisors. And so thank you very much for listening. And I'll leave you with this picture for a moment. It's painted by my friend Mary, who paints lots of different pond scenes. And there's a picture of a pond here with a spangled water beetle, which apparently only exists in one site in the UK. So there you go. Thank you very much for listening. And I would be very happy to take some questions if there are any.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jack. That's really interesting. I must admit, sort of part of my brain is thinking about how we can sort of take this further. Has anyone got any questions? If you have, please put your hand up or take your microphone off mute or write in the text box. If you could make yourself known to us. Simon, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Jack. That was brilliant. I was interested in the distance over which these sounds are detectable.
Yeah, we're not quite sure yet. What we do know is that there are lots of things in ponds that will influence it. So we know that the presence of submerged macrophytes influences that quite a lot. It absorbs quite a lot of the sounds. So it's often in more open water areas where the sound waves can travel in an unimpeded way, where you get clearer detections of things. Whereas if you were to put your hydrophone in the center of a clump of weeds, then you'd only really get a more localized approach. I mean, I'm aware of studies that are doing this in the marine environment where they're suspending hydrophones from buoys and looking at how the sounds of ships are decaying over tens of meters, hundreds of meters. I mean, that would be great to do a similar thing like that in freshwaters, but the answer is that we haven't got around to doing it yet.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
We've got a question from Ailey next, if she'd like to take herself off mute.
Sure, I guess it's kind of relevant or leads on from what Simon was asking, but I was just wondering, I might have missed it, but just with the community difference in the different water bodies in Bristol, and then relating it to the method you've told ecologists to do, was there a difference between did you find what did I write down? It sounded better. Did you find that the size of the water body affected the sound captured, and did you account for it? And then did you only listen to the edges of these water bodies as well, like you showed in the ecologist, or did you listen, like following on from Simon, did you listen to the centre as well?
Yeah, we did account for it, and it didn't really have much of an effect in our data set because we only had 5 sites, and we did just look at sounds around the edge of the pond from one sampling point. So yeah, there's some limitations there. Ideally it would be good to have a whole kind of gridded system of recorders around, but yeah, the ones I was using are quite expensive, and we didn't quite have the resources to do that. But since I started doing my PhD, actually, Audio Moth have released an aquatic version of their recorder. So now it would be much more feasible to do that, to have potentially suspended from buoys. You could have these recorders and get a much more holistic view of what's happening.
Yeah, cool. I just wondered whether, you've said that the community was different in the reservoir and it was more fish, and I just wondered whether you're probably not getting the smaller, the insects and stuff because they're in the reservoir is probably massive compared to the smaller pond in Bristol. But
yeah, well, we looked at 2 reservoirs. There was a bit of a mix in them. One of the reservoirs was incredibly noisy and full of bugs and things, and the other one was less so. I think really the main influence is the presence of fish or not, and species of fish, because they're obviously predating on the water bugs. And one of the reservoirs was stocked with kind of rudd and carp and things, and that was much quieter. Whereas one that was I think it was just stocked with brown trout, just didn't really have a lot of predation going on, so there's much more activity.
cool, thank you.
We've got a question from Deborah. I'm not sure if Deborah has a microphone. I have a feeling she okay, she's told me she doesn't have one. So her question, I'll read it out, is: could this research have beneficial implications for monitoring the I think she's meaning acoustic index of anthropogenic sources of noise on water bodies?
Yes, absolutely. So Camille, the other French researcher who did her PhD on freshwater soundscapes before me, she has looked at that since in a small trial where she had an underwater speaker playing out just kind of like a single tone to represent anthropogenic noise, and that did have a measurable impact on the acoustic activity of these animals in ponds. So it will certainly be having an effect for sure, and we know that it does in other ecosystems, and yeah, there's no reason why we would think it wouldn't in freshwaters. It's again just not something that has been widely studied yet.
Cool, thank you, Deborah. Does anyone else have another question? If not, I have one. David's just taken himself off mute. Go ahead, David.
I was still thinking. I was just going to ask if if you would pick up whether there are, for example, twice as many as a particular water beetle, or I'm thinking some of the species that are normally used in assessing aquatic water condition, like the mayflies and stoneflies and so on. Would it pick up that fine detail through the species identification aspect, or would you just know that the species is there? Or could you get some idea of proportions?
Yeah, I think tricky to get an idea of proportions, but certainly get an idea of presence or absence. Well, certainly presence. Absence is hard to prove, isn't it? But yeah, presence you could absolutely get. And I know that mayflies and stoneflies, they have this drumming on the water surface that they do that you can detect. So there's potential there to use that too.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? I'll ask my question just in a quick before someone jumps in. I was wondering whether there was any effects on the sounds of water itself on how loud the invertebrates were, because we particularly know with sort of using a bird example, sort of some of the small passerines in cities, when anthropogenic noise gets louder, they get louder as well to try and sort of overcome what's going on. And I was wondering whether where you've got fast flowing water sources as opposed to a still pond, do you find that the acoustic levels differ for the same species?
Yeah, I mean, not something that I've looked at. That makes sense to me. I mean, that probably is happening. Certainly in rivers. I mean, I just mentioned these mayfly stoneflies on the surface of waters. Perhaps, I mean, when they're closer to riffles, they're making louder noises. I don't know. Most of the research I've been doing has been in still water habitats, so it's not something that I've been grappling with. But yeah, I think that would be an interesting way to head.
Cool. We've just passed 1:30, so sadly I've seen a few people have had to dash off. If anybody has any last burning questions, make yourself known. Okay. If anyone does have a question from Jack, I hope that they can send a sort of an email to you or sort of a Twitter message, depending if that's all okay.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yeah, you can find my email if you Google me at Bristol.
Fantastic. But thank you very much, Jack. Really interesting. Fantastic to have a talk about something that sort of has not come up before in this way. Yes, thank you everyone else for attending. We will make the video recording available to everyone who wasn't able to join, so you may get some extra questions, Jack. But otherwise, I will stop recording now.